Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the Backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, A History of the Shroud of Turin. It's a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we'll be speaking with Jim Bertrand. He's one of the preeminent speakers on the Shroud of Turin, and we'll be talking about a handful of topics and look forward to the discussion. But before we get started, I thought I'd tell a short story. The Shroud reminds me, unfortunately, of one of the saddest thoughts for anyone, and certainly for any parent. When I think of Mary seeing her son first beaten and tortured and then dying an ignominious death on the cross, it really hits me to the core. My brother was killed by a drunk driver, and when I think of what my mother must have gone through, it strikes me right in my heart. I'm certain that that's what hit Mary as well. When I look on the Shroud and see the wounds, it draws out those feelings for me. But the Shroud also speaks of the most joyous moments in any Christian's heart, and that is the resurrection, one of the most joyous events for all mankind. The mix of emotions, the good, the bad, is what the Shroud represents for me. With that, we're going to let me introduce Jim Bertrand. Jim began teaching high school science in 1981, obtained his master's degree in education in 1987, and taught high school science for 39 years. He is now retired, working full-time giving Shroud presentations. He and his wife have been married for 37 years and have 6 children. They are members of the St. Peter Parish in Lincoln, Nebraska. In the past 7 years, he has given a Shroud talk over 230 times across 12 states, 20 dioceses, and has been seen by over 23,000 people, including the Eucharistic Convention of 2016 in Auckland, New Zealand. He wants you to know that he does not make any money from this. All donations are forwarded to the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud, based in Colorado Springs. Those funds are used to promote this worthy endeavor of disseminating factual information about the Holy Shroud. Jim, thank you so much for being here. So glad to have you. So let's get started. Why don't you tell us a little bit about about your backstory on how you got involved in the Shroud?
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me, Guy. I appreciate that. I had been studying the Shroud kind of personally, like a lot of people I think do, for decades. And then in 1995, I invited Dr. John Jackson, who was the world's foremost authority on the Shroud, to come speak at my parish. I was just that interested in it. And fortunately, we got to host him and his wife. We got to be good friends, and I got to know him over the next 25 years since that time. And around 2014, there was an international Shroud conference here in the United States at St. Louis. And Robert Siefker had been working with Dr. Jackson on assembling all of his 5 decades of research into a book called The Critical Summary. And he was going to present it at that conference, and he asked me to come along as well. And so I did, and attended those 42 scientific presentations. And at the conclusion of that, Bob Siefker asked me if I'd be willing to take this document, the critical summary from Dr. Jackson, put it into a PowerPoint presentation that people could see. And I agreed to that and invested a great deal of time into that. And that's what I've been doing the last 7 years now. And it's just been a wonderful experience. I haven't had a negative experience yet. Every place I've gone to, a real diverse audiences and states and faith backgrounds and those kinds of things. It's all been very positive. So for me, I'd say these last 7 years, I've kind of really increased my awareness and knowledge about the Shroud. And I have to keep up to date on that every few months, looking at the new research and papers and videos and things that come out. So hopefully that answers your question, Guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating. And you're right. The Shroud's been around for 2,000 years, and over the last 100 years or so, certainly the scientific efforts really started, and then with Stirp and everything, it really then progressed. And John Jackson is one of those people. And And actually it's that in the same way that got me really started in it. So yeah, fantastic. And it amazes me as well as how much keeps changing and how many new things come out, and little facts or bigger facts or new findings, and just fascinating. One thing though, as we were talking, as we were preparing for this, one of the things you mentioned is why you felt God preserved the shroud for us. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, people have become saints since, as long as God had created people, and many of them never were aware of the shroud. The shroud is not necessary for, reaching heaven. But during all these centuries that it remained somewhat hidden, there were a few people that were able to, come into contact with it and see it. But now it just seems like ever since 1898, when that first photographic negative was taken, that the interest in the shroud really began. And the 20th century, 21st century, certainly a time of many skeptical people that are thinking that everything needs to be explained in a scientific way in order to be considered truth. And the fact that the more we study the shroud, the more coherent the story becomes. And it just gets stronger and stronger with time. So perhaps he's preserved it for the people of these times who would need that extra faith and reason mix to make that step of faith and trust in Jesus Christ and the resurrection. So the people of our time, perhaps, I think, are maybe more receptive to the shroud from the standpoint that it does hold up so well in the light of scientific research.
Yeah, and I think you're so right with that, and certainly these times, just with the divisions and things like that, there's got to be something that can hopefully get us past that and get us back to really thinking about what God means and what God can do for us. So, how do you think an individual should feel about the shroud?
Well, science can't prove the resurrection, and science can't duplicate the resurrection, but that's a shortcoming of science and not the resurrection. And so for people, I think we need to have a balance of both our faith and our reason, and those things that we can perceive with our senses, we call that reason. But there are realities that we can't perceive with the senses. For example, if God exists as the Trinity, heaven and hell, the existence of angels, we have an eternal soul. Those supernatural realities we have to accept on faith. And that if we have an openness to both of those, I think we have a better view of reality, because if a person's view of reality is just limited to the scientific world alone, then that's a very limited view of reality because of the higher supernatural, transcendental realities above that. So I guess that, in my answer to your question, would be that people should see this as consistent with their faith and reason. If the shroud is not an artist's work, and Barry Schwartz has gone on record saying we've proven that it's not an artist's work because of many unique traits about it, superficiality being one of them, the 3D nature of it. And if it's not a natural process, then what's left? And that's where reason and faith, join together in seeing the resurrection as an explanation for that. The shroud is an effect, and I believe the resurrection to be the cause. And there's a lot of study on what was the mechanism. If you look at that picture, the light areas on that were closest to the cloth, like right on the nose, the cheeks. And there appears to be a direct correlation between the cloth to body distance at the instant of image formation. And yet there's no side images. You don't see any ears on that. And so that would indicate perhaps that gravity may have been a factor in pulling it away from the sides, because there's no side images. So light and gravity appear to be some factors in that. And regarding the light, that was discovered actually by an instrument made by NASA. NASA designed the VP8 image analyzer to map the surface of the moon, which is sensitive to light intensities, all right? And so this image gives us a 3D relief showing that it is sensitive to light intensities. And so we believe that somehow in the mechanism of how that image was formed, light intensity was a factor, because no other picture on Earth will give us a 3D relief when you look at it underneath the VP8 image analyzer from NASA.
Yeah, it is just fascinating. And you mentioned one thing, you said science cannot prove the resurrection. but it also can't disprove it. And so it's kind of interesting how, here we have science, and yet in reality, all that science has done, you still have to have faith that that the resurrection is there, but it's also so much stronger and so much more meaningful than science. Mm-hmm. So what do you think the shroud would mean for a non-Christian?
Well, in light of the few non-Christians I've spoken with about this, they don't seem to have a problem with it. Well, maybe this could be Jesus. It seems to be a mysterious image of Jesus. But then the next step beyond that is, what was the cause? Was the resurrection. Perhaps I think there are non-Christians who accept that this image, okay, we can't explain how this image was formed, but for them, it doesn't necessarily prove the resurrection. Or if it does prove a resurrection, is Jesus Christ God? Was Jesus Christ just a man only? And of course, we believe that he was God with a human nature and a divine nature. So it doesn't definitively convert people, so to speak. But the shroud has never been a debate that I see. I simply see it as, you present the facts and let the facts speak for themselves, and then let the people's own well-reasoned judgment come to their conclusion about, okay, if this is not natural, then this is supernatural. I did have an occasion to speak with many non-Christians in a couple of the prisons that I went to, the Nebraska State Penitentiary for Men, and that's in Lincoln. And then there's another one for women in York, the Women's Correctional Facility. And the one for the women was really a memorable one. It was on about 4 years ago on the morning of Good Friday. And there was lightning and rain and thunder, and it was just a real storm. And in the midst of this, we had to wait for the lightning to go away before they could come out of their barracks to come to the main building we were going to be in. So it started about a half an hour late. And I think most of these women had never heard of the shroud. And so as I was beginning to speak about it, they were starting to see this and like, wow, I never realized something like this could exist. And usually people wait till the end to ask questions. But what was neat, the lady started asking questions along the way about every second or third slide. What's that? Where did that come from? What are those holes? And they were just really, really very keenly interested in it. And by the time I was through, they seemed to be radiant with joy and just beaming about the resurrection, because the resurrection is, if you have faith in that, if Jesus was resurrected and says that that's part of our future too, that gives them hope. And I think for many people, the shroud is a message of hope. These women in prison were certainly living through their Good Friday. Many of them have children, under the age of 5 or so, and they can't see them. These women probably cry themselves to sleep at night, and they don't have much hope. But after encountering the face of Jesus and the resurrection and looking forward to that with hope, then that gives them something to look forward to in terms of their Easter Sunday. And for us too, we're living through some Good Fridays, and I've no doubt we have some more ahead of us. But we need to keep in mind that at the end, we have that ultimate joy of an Easter Sunday in our future as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely a great story about the value of hope, and that the shroud kind of represents that as something we can actually tangibly see. Let me switch over a little bit, and one of the challenges with the shroud is that it has a documented history, and then there's a lot of pieces missing, and then there's maybe then the going back further even to the resurrection itself, and that time in Golgotha in Jerusalem, that there's the shroud and the mention of the shroud in the Bible, and then there's this period in the middle, and you could argue how big or small or how long or short it is, but this missing period, where there's no written historical record of the shroud. After about, and I don't remember the year exactly, 1350 or so, there starts to be a record that the shroud is on is being exhibited and shown, and then is written. Tell us a little bit about that missing period in there, and some of the things that you believe really still prove that the shroud itself is authentically is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus Christ?
Certainly. Well, there's some open questions regarding the shroud. For instance, what caused the discrepancy of the carbon dating in 1988? Was it this or this or this? Mm-hmm. That's an open question. And many of the other open questions regard its history. We know it was in Constantinople in the year 1201, in that it was recorded by Nicholas Meserites as being in the inventory at the royal palace. And we had an eyewitness account a couple of years later in 1204 of a French crusader, Robert de Clary, who witnessed the shroud being venerated. And he describes how it was lifted up out of a box, you know, and it doesn't take much imagination to imagine candles burning on each side of it and the people venerating the shroud. And to verify his eyewitness account, there are fold marks in the shroud, several of them. And linen has somewhat of a memory, and if you fold a linen for a long period of time, that crease is still there. And the creases, the folds in the shroud linen indicate it was folded in a certain way that it could indeed fit in the box, as Robert de Clary described, it'd be about 2 cubits wide, about 21 inches wide, and they would raise it up, and they would see the front half, say from the waist to the head there. So that was some historical information. There was, if we go back farther than that, in 692, there was a coin called the Justinian II Tremesis coin. And that coin, there's a remarkable likeness to the shroud. And it was studied by Dr. Giulio Fonte of the University of Padua in Italy. And he looked at 12 different features of the face regarding the ratio of the nose to the eyes, the cheeks, the asymmetrical face. And to get all these features right would be astronomically nearly impossible. It'd be like 10 to the 8th power against being able to just do this. And there were many other coins in Europe that were made, and all of them had those imperfections. But this one that was minted in Constantinople in 692 matches it like a glove. And so he concluded in his book with 99.99% certainty that whoever made that coin, whoever minted that coin in 692 had to have been in the presence of the shroud, you know, to get all those details. And well, looking at those open questions of history, you know, from 1204 to 1355, those are referred to as the missing years. And there have been some possibilities there. You know, was it the Knights Templar? That sounds like a very romantic one that the TV shows like to show. There doesn't seem to be very solid evidence on that. Did it go through Jeanne de Vergy's family line? She was the one who married Joffre de Charnay. Or did it go through Joffre de Charnay's line? So those are the open questions that haven't been opened yet. But if we back up a little further than that, you know, how did it get from Jerusalem to Constantinople? There have been 2 suggestions proposed, one by Ian Wilson, that it went through Edessa and then to Constantinople in 944, and the other one proposed by Dr. Jack Marquardt, that it went from Jerusalem to Antioch and then to Constantinople in 574. So those are open questions on the history. But regarding other artwork, we see a picture from the year 550 AD, and most people are familiar with this picture called the Pantocrator icon. And in a court of law, if you have 45 to 60 points of congruence between, say, the artist drawing and the defendant, that's enough to prove you're talking about the same person. Well, when we look at the points of congruence between that Pantocrator face and the shroud, there are over 150 points of congruence, as determined by Alan Wanger and another researcher. And so there's another point saying that, well, we don't know, you know, who made that picture, but whoever made it had to have been looking at the shroud to get all those features right. And what's interesting, Guy, is we discovered that picture at the foot of Mount Sinai, where Moses received the 10 Commandments, is St. Catherine's Monastery. And this is where this picture was discovered. There's actually 41 Pantocrators that follow this same pattern of the Lord's right hand raised in blessing and his left hand holding the book, the mercy and justice of God. But the Pantocrator from 550 evidently was the prototype that all the other ones copied, and that has followed artwork down the centuries. In talking about how Robert de Clary observed in 1204, in April of 1204, his eyewitness account of the shroud being raised up on Fridays, we have artwork from a century or 2 before that showing that the shroud was indeed raised up out of a box and his right hand over the left, just as we see on the shroud. You know, very interesting details. They're called the Man of Sorrows icons, and these icons are numerous from those centuries. So artwork and some eyewitness account from Robert de Clary and coins and pictures and things definitely give a consistent, I think, view, a coherent view that the shroud was present in these early centuries, but we just didn't have a day-by-day tracking of it. And if you think about it, people accept, let's say that they've recovered the bones of King Tut, right? You know, they got that these are the remains of King Tut. Nobody seems to question that. But we don't have a day-by-day accounting of it, but yet the evidence is enough that we're willing to accept that. And whereas the evidence on the shroud is under much greater scrutiny. But you know, when the Stirk team published their results in 1978, there were those 33 scientists that had 120 hours of access to the shroud. And for 3 years, they published their scientific information in scientific professional peer-reviewed journals across the world. And after 3 years, they made their final statement, so to speak. They couldn't answer the question, how was the image formed? But they did state these 3 facts, that there's no pigment or any type of stuff on the image-bearing fibers. There's just nothing there. It's just somehow yellowed in some way. And it's not the work of an artist, and this is not a natural process. And those 3 facts still hold up today after 40 years and after scientific scrutiny. And to me, that's a mark of good science, that those 3 things can still be stated, and they've withstood the test of time.
Yeah, and I think, and I agree with you. It's kind of surprising to me that you have a written record, and that's kind of believed, but then you have a coin that, you know, had to have been the artist that minted that coin, that designed that coin, had to have seen the shroud to be able to mint that coin. Similarly with the Pantocrator, that artist had to have seen the shroud in order to be able to do that and make that painting. And so I always find it, I don't know, difficult to understand how an anti-shroudist, especially those that really believed in the carbon-14 testing that was done in the late 80s, how they can discount the proof of the coins, the art, and all of the other things that you mentioned, Robert de Clary and what have you, that they discount those and say, nope, it's 1260 to 1390, and it can't be anything earlier. I just have trouble with that. So sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say perhaps some people are just not aware of the data, and they think that we're just repeating things. But in fact, the data on that coin I can give you was that when Dr. Giulio Fanti wrote this book, The First Century of Christ, the Shroud of Turin, First Century of Christ, one of the 12 features was the ratio between the eyes and the nose. And so from the middle of the pupil to your middle of pupil, that's considered a distance of 1.0. And the length of the nose comes out to be 1.8. That's on the shroud. Well, on this Tremesis coin, it is exactly a 1 to 1.28 ratio. All right. And you just don't get those things by accident. The facts on that kind of speak for themselves. And that's just one of the features. Right. And there were 12 of them. So perhaps people that doubt it maybe aren't aware of the objectivity that has gone into this. And another thing about the shroud is that for people that their faith rests on the resurrection, we don't have to have the shroud be authentic. Yeah. You know, if the shroud were suddenly declared that it wasn't authentic, it would not affect my faith one iota, because my faith rests on the resurrection. But the fact that the shroud is so consistent with that certainly makes it easy to see faith and reason together. But if the shroud were proven to be not authentic, we could afford to be wrong on this. Yeah. Yeah. But for the person who doubts the resurrection, they can't afford to be wrong, because if it is authentic, then you have to make a choice on how you're going to live your life. And it's a wonderful open opportunity to see heaven, eternity, and a loving Savior that we have that has suffered so much for us. And so, you know, I'm sure God has his reasons for doing things, but for me, that's one thing that I see with it.
Yeah, and I agree with you about the faith and the questions. And I always think of the upper room and Thomas saying, I won't believe until I can stick my fingers in the wound and in the, you know, the holes in the hands and wrists, and yet you know, it's that, you know, I won't believe until I see. Even him, you know, early on with the apostles, it must have been just so eye-opening and to see Jesus coming through the door or through the wall, however he got in there, and then to have him be seen in other places by the thousands, and then on the road to Emmaus and what have you, just fascinating. So anyway, one other thing that I thought would be interesting is the face cloth of Oviedo. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. There is another cloth that's about 33 inches by 21 inches that has a series of blood stains and fluids on it. And it is currently in Oviedo, Spain. It has been there since at least 714 AD. And in studying this sudarium, tradition has said that it came out of Palestine in about the year 611 when it was being attacked by the Persians, I believe. And to escape that, it was taken into Spain. And when we compare that, and it was always revered as the faith cloth that had been on Christ when he was crucified. And some people wonder, well, how can that be? Well, after Jesus had expired on the cross, he's dead there, and his blood is dripping out of his eyes, his nose, his mouth, his ears. And in Jewish culture, blood is considered part of the body. And so it would be entirely consistent for them to take a headcloth of some type and wrap it around his head to preserve that blood, so that when he's taken to the tomb, the blood goes with him and his whole body is there, so to speak. And so you don't see any image on this cloth, but when we look, imagine this cloth being on his head for a matter of, who knows, 10, 15 minutes, whatever, from the time he's taken down from the cross and carried to the tomb, and then that headcloth is set aside. And then, of course, after the resurrection, this could be the headcloth rolled up in a place by itself. There's also some open question that there was another headcloth in there as well. But regarding the sudarium of Oviedo, these blood stains are the same blood type. They're both AB, but beyond that, you can overlap them on one-to-one transparencies, and there are blood stains that match up. And there's also travertine aragonite soil, which is found in Jerusalem and only a handful of places on earth, on the nose from the shroud. It's also found in this headcloth. And we also find pollen grains from Jerusalem that are unique to Jerusalem on this headcloth. And so this is considered first-class scientific information. That is, it's accepted by the scientific world that headcloth, the sudarium, and the shroud had to have wrapped the same person at the same time to get those consistencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny how the shroud gets a lot more exposure, so to speak, to people like us, and the sudarium a little bit less, and yet the two really go almost hand in hand in terms of potentially, and certainly I believe, and I think you do too, that both of them that were there in the tomb and were there during Jesus' resurrection and at that particular moment. But you did mention something as well, this concept of mechanically transparent. Tell us what you mean by that and how that applies to what we're talking about.
Sure. Well, what does mechanically transparent mean? Well, how can we recreate the resurrection? Well, we can't recreate the resurrection, but if at the instant of the resurrection, light and gravity were somehow involved with putting as a mechanism, perhaps the cloth collapsing through the body would have been what that scenario may have looked like. And this body that the cloth collapsed through, we call that mechanically transparent. It's no longer supporting the cloth. And so imagine this, the cloth over the person's nose, and as it collapses down through the body, it pulls out at the sides. And so you have no side images, because anything that was more than a few millimeters away from the body does not show up on the shroud. And so this idea of something being mechanically transparent is something we're familiar with. If we think how Christ appeared to the apostles on Easter night, remember they're locked in the upper room out of fear, and Christ comes among them. Well, how could that be? Well, if his body was mechanically transparent, if we accept on faith that he had a resurrected body, then we could accept that he could go through that door like it wasn't there, and his body was no longer subject to the laws of physics and nature as we know them. All right, so if that's a mechanically transparent body on Easter night, then the question becomes, when did that moment begin? And if that moment began at the instant of the resurrection, then that would explain how the cloth could have collapsed to a mechanically transparent body in the plane of gravity, pulling out from the sides, resulting in a vertically aligned 3D image that we see on the shroud with a cloth to body distance, a compatibility corresponding with what we see in the picture up here in the photographic negative. Yeah, that's about a 15-page scientific paper summed up in a minute there. If you've ever read Dr. Jackson's paper on this, it's fascinating. It's on shroudofturin.com, and he has diagrams and explains that, but I do the best I can here by just word of mouth if I can.
Yeah.
I would like to pass on, Guy, a couple of other little known facts for your audience as they watch this, because many times you don't see these kinds of things on television programs. One of them is that there is no image under the blood. And if you think about that, if you were an artist and you were going to make the shroud, you would have somehow put the image on it. You would have, painted it or rubbed something on it or dropped it on a hot statue, and you get the image of the body on the fiber, and then you would put the blood on top of it so that it could be anatomically correct. And the blood stains on the shroud are anatomically correct, right? So an artist will put the image first and the blood on top, right? But the shroud does not show that. The shroud shows that the blood went on to the linen first. Good Friday and Holy Saturday as he laid in the tomb. And the image came on afterwards, Easter Sunday. And so once again, this consistency of blood first, image second is consistent with the Gospels of a Good Friday followed by an Easter Sunday. And there's another little known fact that people don't know about the shroud. If they examine the scourge marks across the back, they're very distinct. You can see the little pairs of balls as he was scourged with the flagrum. But then as you get up around the shoulder area, it becomes much more blurred and disfigured. And so if he were scourged and then had to bear a beam across his back, most likely a single patibulum, weighing 60 to 90 pounds perhaps, the movement of that across his shoulders would mutilate the scourge marks. And so the fact that we see clear scourge marks on his back and blurry scourge marks across his shoulders is also consistent with the Gospels of a scourging followed by having to bear a weight across his shoulders.
Well, and that's one thing too, is how consistent the shroud is to the accounts that are in the Gospels, in terms of the the crossbar. What did you call it? The tibulum.
The patibulum. The patibulum is the horizontal beam.
The crossbar from the cross, and then you have the scourging and the scourge marks, and hundreds of them. It's just, that's where, when I look at it and I see those, and that's where I think about how Mary, how could she bear having seen her son to suffer like that, and realizing that at the end of that, his death is near. And then of course he, to have him up on the cross and having the nails in through his wrists and through his ankles, and then having to, watch him take his last breaths, just incredible.
It really is moving to think about that. I would like to take that opportunity when you talk about the number of scourge marks to point out something, because sometimes people will say, well, I saw this on one program, but I read this someplace else, and they think that there's misinformation. The way you count the number of scourge marks is a very subjective art, all right? And so I've seen variations from 200 to 600. All right. In the critical summary book that Dr. Jackson has, the number is 372. There are 159 on the front and something like 213 on the back. But in reality, there were more scourge marks than that, because there's no side images. And he would have had scourge marks across the sides of his ribs. So, we don't really, need to know the exact number of scourge marks on the back in order to say, well, we need to be consistent about this, just because it's one of those areas where there's an open question. So whether you're reading about the shroud's travels before the 12th century or the number of scourge marks, there's open questions in those areas that maybe it's difficult to find agreement on.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that's part of it too, because you look at Ian Wilson and his path of the shroud through Edessa, and then you have others potentially having the shroud through Antioch, and then you have others that the Romans bought the shroud from the Muslims after the Muslims took over Edessa and what have you. And maybe that's part of the problem. But nevertheless, all of the things that you talked about in terms of the coins and the Pantocrator, and then certainly the congruity between the story in the Bible and then what's seen on the shroud itself, all of those things really, in my mind, are historical proof, with some questions in the middle as to exactly what happened. And now a couple of things you didn't mention, but I know you know about them. One is the Prey Codex. Maybe talk a little bit about that as well.
Well, I wish we had some way to show the slides to the people here with a screen share, but there is a manuscript. It's about 10 inches by 6 inches in a museum library in Budapest, Hungary. And it is the oldest surviving parchment in the country of Hungary. It's called the Prey Codex, or the Prey Codex manuscript. And it depicts Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And you can see, the body being laid on the linen. You see the right hand over the left. There's Christ's body being prepared on Good Friday. Then the lower picture depicts an Easter Sunday. And there's an angel pointing to the empty cloths. And there's the 3 women arriving at the tomb. And there are red crosses, which we believe represent the bloodstains from the shroud. But there's 2 other details in that picture that point to the fact that whoever made this picture, and by the way, it was recorded on their inventory in the year 1192. It was made sometime prior to that. Who knows if we're talking 10 years or a century before that. And inside the picture, there's details showing the 3-in-1 herringbone weave. And the shroud is a very unique type of weave. You just don't find the 3-in-1 herringbone weave on linen. It's very, very rare. It's never been found in Europe in linen at any time in history, but it was present before, during, and after the time of Christ, this Jewish weave with the 3-in-1. And then inside, there are these holes that are shaped like a backward 7. And we find these on the shroud in 4 locations. And we can tell how the shroud is folded because they're like mirrors of each other. Okay, so we know, okay, these were folded together, and then it was folded together this way. And we know that when you fold it this way, the shroud would be 4 cubits by 1 cubit, which is about 7 feet by 21 inches. Yeah, and it fits very neatly over an altar. And these 4 holes show up right in the middle. Mm-hmm. And it's been suggested, and reasonably so, in 2002, I believe, that perhaps if there was some incense in a bowl, and the shroud is being venerated on an altar, and 4 large pieces and 15 or 20 smaller pieces fall onto the shroud, they'd be brushed away quickly, but it would take less than 3 seconds for them to burn through 1.3 millimeters. That's 4 layers of shroud. So we believe those holes were put because it was on the altar. And then you ask the question, what was it doing on the altar? Well, in the Catholic Mass, in all 29 rites and in all 15 rites of the Orthodox Church, there is a linen that is folded and is used on the altar for the consecration. And this dates back to the 1st century, and that the Holy Mass is the sacrifice of Christ. And we believe that Jesus rose from the shroud, and we receive the living God. We don't receive a dead Jesus in communion. We receive the living God, and that the linen that we have on the altar for Masses today goes back to that shroud of the resurrection on Easter morning.
Yeah, it did, and that is a fascinating story, and it's interesting how that may have actually caused that, and then but as being proof potentially that it was that the shroud was known well before even the 1201 that you mentioned in Constantinople, and all of these different points really are kind of proof that there is good congruence that history, or that the shroud existed prior to when when it was first started to be recorded in the 1350s or so. One thing you'd mentioned, if you don't mind me kind of changing the subject a little bit, for me, the book of Isaiah is incredible in its foretelling of the New Testament, basically, and of Jesus Christ. And one of the verses that you mentioned in one of your talks is Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, and I'll read it. It's, "I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting." Maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of how that was written hundreds of years prior to the death and resurrection of Jesus, and yet it reflects so much of what we even see in the shroud and what we also know from the story of Jesus from the Gospels.
Yeah, certainly, Guy. I'd be glad to. I'm glad you brought that up. I think I can get you a little closer up on this picture here. Okay, the scourge marks on the back speak for themselves, but if you look at this face here, if you look at the right cheek, it appears slightly lighter in color. And that's because the forensic pathologist for Los Angeles County has verified that this right cheek shows significant swelling relative to the left. And because it's swelled up, it's tighter against the cloth. And that's why it's lighter in color. So my cheeks, my face, I did not shield from buffets. That shows the face being struck. And now if you look at the chin, all right, you see that little black circle down there across the line goes there. That black circle is a missing beard. His beard has been pulled out. I gave my beard to those who pulled it out. I gave my cheeks to those who pulled my beard. And so what I'm saying, I guess, is that the shroud is a physical manifestation of how that prophecy of Isaiah was fulfilled.
Yeah, and that's just, it's fascinating how that matches so closely. It just really shows the God inspiration of the writing and the canonization of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Mm-hmm. It really does.
Yes, I agree.
So what other questions do you think kind of remain about the shroud? What do you think is really open in your mind that you would potentially hope and see might get resolved here in the next couple of years, couple decades, couple centuries? Yes. I don't know.
Well, historically, I think it's possible to perhaps resolve what was the shroud's route from Jerusalem to Constantinople. There's agreement on that. Did it go through Antioch or did it go through Edessa as the Mendelian? I would like to think that that's going to be resolved. There's a new book that just came out by Dr. Jack Markworth that's going to be read. And we'll see what scholars say about that. So in coming decades, that's a possibility. He's also worked on the question of the missing years from 1204, from the sack of Constantinople, until 1355, when Geoffroy de Charnay displays it in France. That 150-year period appears that it might have been linked in some way to St. Louis IX, whose cousin was Baldwin III. Baldwin III was the emperor of Constantinople when the sack took place. And it's possible that it could have gone that route and basically through Geoffroy de Charnay's family. So I think those two historical questions would be nice to be answered. I'm not sure if we'll get the one on, okay, so we know there was a persecution in Jerusalem in 44 AD, and was that the time when Peter may have brought the shroud with him? Because the lost gospel of the Hebrews that's shared with us by St. Jerome states that the high priest brought with him, the linens. That's not part of the canon of the Bible. So that's an open question. We would need some more confirmation on that. And I don't foresee that in the near future. So those first at least 5 centuries might always remain an open question. And then, of course, the last question was what was the mechanism, for putting this image? How was the image formed? I believe, like many people, that the cause and effect. I believe in cause and effect, that the resurrection was the cause, and this image that we see on the shroud is the effect. But what was the mechanism? And we appears to be light and gravity, but God's ways are not necessarily our ways. If you think about the other miracles God did, his first miracle at Cana, they fill these stone jars full of water. That's H2O, right? And minutes later, the steward tastes it and it's wine. That's carbon nitrogen. That's a creation thing that matter wasn't there. Now the matter is there. If you had taken scientists present at the wedding at Cana and asked them to sample that wine and explain it, they would all state that it was, months or years old, and it must have come from these grapes, and they would all be wrong. Our science would be wrong in trying to understand a miracle. And so we have to be open to that same limitation with the shroud, in that, does God have to have it fall at 9.8 meters per second squared? Does he have to have the radiant energy travel at 186,000 miles per second? God can do what he wants to, and his ways are not our ways. So we may not ever duplicate the mechanism, but I think there's enough information there to reasonably put together cause and effect.
Yeah. And by the way, that wine was supposedly the best wine.
I've always wondered, I would love to taste that. That's what wine should taste like. I've always wanted a glass.
Apparently. Yeah, exactly. So
if they had some left over, I don't know where it's at, but they probably got all drank, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting as well is when will and if when will there be potentially another radiocarbon dating? And so the last one was in the late 80s. And it kind of reminds me, maybe the Pope, the current owner of the shroud, maybe he'll let it be re-carbon dated again at some point. And I kind of liken that to the 40 years in the wilderness of the Israelites. God had to wait till the kind of the stiff-necked, stubborn Israelites to kind of die off, and then the new ones would come along and they'd be ready to enter into Canaan. So maybe
maybe that would be 2028 then, right? 2028.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, two things on that. Number one, if we before we could do another carbon dating, we would need to ascertain and understand what was the reason why we had a discrepancy in 1988, that it was getting a century, 91 to 97 years younger every inch as you move toward the center of the shroud. Because until we can understand what was the cause for that, another carbon dating test might give us a very, very wild answer. For example, one of these threads from that area was given to the Tucson lab in 1994. A little thread about that long. And one end of that thread, this is the same dating lab in Tucson, Arizona that was used in 1988. One end tested out at 200 AD. The other end tested out at 1000 AD. Now, how can you have the same thread be so discrepant there? There's something very mysterious going on that we can't explain. And so any valid carbon dating test would have to address that question and be able to, okay, here's what we need to do if we're going to get an accurate reading. Because if they don't, another reading will just simply come up at probably maybe even newer, because I don't know if you knew it or not, but from after the fire of 1997, the shroud was placed in a new container, and that container had been doused with thymol, C10H14O. All right, a lot of carbon, and it may have rejuvenated and gotten to those fibers, so to speak, to alter the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. It might even appear to be younger than the 1988 test. So we really have nothing to gain from another carbon test at the present time if we can't understand what caused the problems in the first place. Yeah. And then the second thing I would bring out is that certainly we would look forward to further testing on the shroud. There are 25 other areas that can be tested besides carbon dating. And perhaps that would be a nice thing to happen in the future. But is there enough information based on what we know for people to come to their own well-reasoned judgment? And I believe there is. There's another group of people who feel like all they need to do is test it and do another carbon dating test. It'll come out the first century and then it's resolved for all time.
Yeah, I think that's impossible.
I don't adhere to that.
Yeah, I don't either. Yeah. It's funny, and sorry to interrupt you there, but Joe Marino in his latest book, I thought it was interesting, but it really goes through every piece of evidence that is out there on the time before the carbon dating itself, and then the time afterward. And what was interesting was that it almost seemed like those people that were part of the carbon dating really wanted to debunk the shroud as the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ, when in reality now, over the last, whatever that is, 30 years, I guess, the radiocarbon dating has been debunked. That carbon dating was done so poorly. Not only were the samples done wrong, but they found cotton in the cloth, which wouldn't be right. They didn't clean the cloth potentially, because what you were talking about in terms of how they were holding it, and then the fact that there's different dates as you progress along that one piece of thread. There's been so many different things that have kind of debunked the debunking, so to speak, that I think all of the other proof that you've mentioned and that's out there, and I hopefully I'll be able to learn more about it, but all of the other proof is out there is almost overwhelming, and you have one that is kind of stands out as being wrong, and yet that one technically and procedurally and operationally was done incorrectly.
And in the world of science, you would throw out that one test that doesn't exactly, that's incoherent with this other vast volume of information. It's just overwhelming. And there were 15 protocols that were violated in that as well. And it came out by Tristan Casabianca. He initiated this process in 2017. You spoke about that with Barry, I believe. And in 2019, he published his paper showing that there was significant deviation and that this was an invalid, that the data shows that it's from an objective point of view, you do something called the chi-square test. And under the scrutiny of the chi-square test, the data is significantly deviation. And so you have to throw it out. So to me, it's not an issue anymore. And I think for people that are aware of that, it's not an issue anymore. But I think most of the general public hasn't been made aware of that the raw data from the carbon dating test was not divulged after that test. And it wasn't until recently that we really got the facts.
Yeah, well, and you're right about the general public, unless you actually start to dig into it personally. You know, I mean, I had the same problem. I had kind of heard in the background that, you know, the radiocarbon testing debunked the at the time the authenticity of the shroud, and you know, and I kind of just put that away. And it wasn't until I started reading Ian Wilson's book that I said, "Oh my God, no, there's a lot more here than just this one test that failed." And so, unfortunately, the general public and even a lot of Christians aren't going to, you know, dig that much further, and so they're going to still believe in the resurrection, but they may not necessarily see the real authenticity and of the shroud itself. So
sure, one of the unfortunate side effects from that 1988 carbon test being so published the way it was as debunking the shroud was that for the next couple decades, it pretty much took the shroud off of the radar.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, many people grew up never having heard of it, or the only thing they knew about it was the carbon dating test. And I found in the high schools I've gone to, I've been to probably 25, 30 high schools across the country. I would say, based on my experience, less than half of young people under age 30 have heard of the shroud. And that's a direct casualty from that fiasco carbon dating test of 1988. But we're coming out of that now.
I think so. And I know your work and hopefully everything else is done. I mean, one of my, I don't know if I'd call it a mission, but certainly an objective of the book that I've written now is to help to bring that story back to life. And hopefully that'll also bring Christians or non-Christians over to Christianity. Hopefully we'll be able to evangelize and get people to really see that, you know, if they had doubts before, or if they never realized it, and then, hey, here's this one thing that proves that resurrection that actually took place, then maybe that'll also start to bring some non-Christians over to Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So with that, I know we're really at the end of our time here, and but I definitely thank you so much, Jim. I really, really appreciate it. That was awesome. And thank you so much for, and also thank you for all you do. I mean, you're out there really on the front lines of spreading the good word about the shroud, but more importantly, the good word about Jesus, and that you know, you don't necessarily have to have the shroud to believe in the resurrection, but the shroud is definitely something that is of interest to all Christians and certainly even non-Christians. But I do want to mention one thing, and that is I want to mention the website, the shroudconfraternity.org, and that is for the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud. That's what where a lot of your work and I think a lot of your efforts kind of try to benefit. And maybe just talk a second about that, and then we'll kind of close it out.
Sure. Well, my job is a communicator, in which I should take the scientific information and convey it to people in such a way so that they can understand it. So I'm kind of this in between the research and the public. How's that information going to get across? Or so that's what I see my role as. And the information gathering is the Turin Shroud Center. The Turin Shroud Center, run by Dr. John Jackson in Colorado Springs, conducts the research and educational basis for what I'm talking about. And I take that information, put it into a 60-minute PowerPoint, and that is the evangelization outreach of the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud. So Turin Shroud Center is research education, and then the confraternity, the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud, also based in Colorado Springs, is the evangelical outreach. So that's kind of the faith and the reason of it. And I'd like people to be aware that if they would like to have this in their area, perhaps you can show my card up there with the contact information, with an email and a phone number. And basically, I come and give these talks. I don't ask for any honorarium. They just cover my travel expenses. And actually, we've gone to 13 states now. Just pick up another state here recently, another diocese. So I'll go outside the state if people wish to see this presentation there. And I bring an actual replica of the shroud. And the company that makes these from Barry Schwartz, they tell me there are fewer than 50 of these in the world. EWTN has one. There's one in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. There's a museum in Shreveport, Louisiana that has one, St. John Birchman's. There are some kind of cheaper facsimiles that are yellow and purple out there that are not, those were not confirmed by Barry Schwartz. Barry took the pictures for the Stirp team, and this is the one company that he has said that, okay, this is what I saw, and this is the real thing. You've got it. And so they're the only ones that have the rights to produce those. And I happen to have one of those, and I bring along with me. It's about 14 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 7 inches. It's huge, and we display it at eye level. So anyway, I'll put that offering out there. I appreciate your help me on that, Guy. If you want to just give my contact information in case there are others that like to have this in their community. It doesn't necessarily have to be a church setting. I do schools, universities, prisons, retired groups, Sertoma clubs. I mean, you name it. Groups anywhere from 30 to 3,000.
Well, I will definitely put your contact information, your email, the shroudconfraternity.org, the American Confraternity of the Holy Shroud, the email bsaints2@gmail.com, and on the link when we post the video, we'll have all of that information on there, and hopefully that'll lead to further communications about the shroud and then certainly of Jesus Christ.
Sure. Well,
so
God opens these doors for me, and I'll go through them. And
exactly.
With that, I will close. And I want to thank you very much, Guy, for your excellent preparation and questions. You did a fine job.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed the conversation, Jim. So please stay tuned. We will have other videos and other interviews on this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. Please visit guypowell.com and sign up to view more episodes. Thank you very much.